minority representation. I'm sure she'll explain more on this when she's on the floor. Uh, she is particularly invested in studying vocational and technical education in colonial and post-colonial India and in questions of science and technology, especially in its engagement with bodies and identities, and widely recognized for her engagement with both academic and public-facing writing. Uh, so this is a question which has always been on academics' mind, how we negotiate academic and popular writing. And here we are to learn a lot. So I welcome you. Please. Yeah, yeah. Please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Kaushalya and Ideas and Jindal for inviting me for this session and also for calling me political theorist. That has never been said before. In fact, even political scientist is a bit doubtful. But thank you. I will take that with me. So, yeah, thank you all for joining for this session. I've been talking to some of you, and I believe you've traveled far and wide to come here. Thank you very much. It's a small group, and I think this is the ideal number to do a writing workshop in. And so, what we will do is we will talk a little bit about why we are discussing this today. And I'm assuming, and I'll quickly ask you, but I'm assuming that most of us in this room are academics or in training to be academics. And so we'll discuss a little bit about why this question of public engagement or popular engagement at all. And then what I'll do is, in the spirit of a workshop, I will take you through a sort of a close reading of one piece published on a public platform. I'm sure some of you have already read that piece. And we'll also, in that process, do two very small writing exercises, right? Not something, not writing very long passages or something, but something very short. And because this is a small group, I'm hoping we'll get a chance to read or see what most of you have written. So that's the plan for today. But before I begin, sorry, when do I have to finish? Okay, I will try and finish within time, maybe a little over time. Okay. So before we begin, let me get a sense of the room. So what are most of us, what stage of our academics are we at? Are some of us post-PhD? Are we early career scholars? Like, I'm post-PhD. Post-PhD. Others? No. Okay. PhDs? Most of us are PhDs. Masters? Okay. Bachelors? No. Oh, that's very nice. In Jindal, you hardly ever are in a room where there are no BA students. So this is very nice. So we are looking at masters and PhD and very few post-PhD. Okay. Masters folks, are you writing a thesis? Are you supposed to write a thesis? Yeah? Not all, but maybe some, right? Increasingly, master's thesis is becoming a thing, right? Okay. And discipline-wise, where are we located? I'm assuming mostly humanities, social sciences, right? History? No. Literature? Pol science? Oh no. Sociology? What are the rest? Oh, IR. IR is pol science. Uh, I'll get into trouble. I'll get into a lot of trouble for saying that. Okay, IR. Oh, behavioral sciences, IR. What else? Media studies, development studies. Development. Where is development studies happening? Which university? Oh, ideas. Oh, okay, okay. The MSc in development studies. Okay, okay. You're the fancy Delhi campus folks. Oh, okay, nice. Okay, all right. Just to get a sense of, where am I pitching this at? So, I am, like I said, I'm trained as a political scientist, but a lot of my work lies on the interface between political science and sociology, specifically anthropology. So that's where most of my examples or how I look at the world really comes from. Okay, so let's begin, and let's think a little. You are in the workshop? Okay, very quickly. Masters, PhD, post PhD? All masters. What discipline? What studies? African studies. Where is this? Delhi University. All of you African studies. Okay, great. Okay, so let's begin thinking a little bit about what is academic writing to begin with, because the purpose of this workshop, and that's what Dipanshu, the Dean of Ideas, suggested, that we talk a little bit about taking academic writing to public forums, a very specific brief he said we should do. And he was very clear that we're not here to discuss, and I think that's an important distinction, that we're not discussing how to just write for the public, because there are many kinds of ways in which we can write for the public, right? Starting from a tweet to an editorial to a novel, there are many kinds of ways. Well, we are not discussing that. We are discussing a very specific thing. As academics, how do we take our academic arguments? And most of us know that an academic argument is a very specific thing, and we'll discuss more as we go ahead, right? So it's a very specific thing. It's not interchangeable with other kinds of writings that we do, right? Fiction, non-fiction, social media writing. It's not the same as academic writing, right? And so let's talk a little bit about what we understand as academic writing, especially coming from our respective disciplines, right? And let's also think about, is it not public, right? Or why is it not public, right? And there's a reason why the why is in brackets, because I'm also questioning, is academic writing already not public, right? And which means we'll also think a little bit about what is public. So when we say popular platforms or public platforms or public facing scholarship, what do we mean as public? And if we think public is something out there where we want to write for, what is this? Right? So let's think a little bit about all of these issues, right? So what is academic writing according to you? Anyone? I will not take answers from people I have taught this to. Someone else. Yes? That's very interesting. Say more. What is scientific method? Okay, that's, I completely agree. So it's a structured writing, and I think that's very, very important, right? Academic writing follows a particular structure, and I'll go ahead and say it also follows a particular code. And we'll talk a little bit more about the code in just a minute, right? But it follows a particular structure which is very specific to academic writing, right? And when I say this, you are already thinking of some structure, right? Because you have read articles in that format, you've been asked to write in that format, and that structure largely comes from what our friend here is saying, this scientific approach. Whether we're doing social sciences, humanities, or natural sciences, the idea of writing something which is credible, which is universal, which is evidence-based, comes from that broadly what we are calling the scientific approach, which is that we are not, when we are writing academically, we are not in the business of writing our opinion. We are not in the business of writing about our beliefs. We are not in the business of writing about what I feel like, right? But very strictly, whichever discipline we are writing in, we are writing something which is backed by evidence and which is sort of acceptable as evidence and acceptable as an argument by a community of our peers, right? And that's the hallmark of academic writing. So there's a certain structure which follows from these percepts, right? That we need to have a very clear understanding of what is our claim, what is our evidence, and thus what is the argument that we are making. Now, there could be other forms of writing like journalistic, which follows a similar structure. They need to have evidence as well, right? But where would the difference between journalistic writing and academic writing fall? Sorry? Say more. So the difference lies in evidence, not so much claim, right? Claims both make. Journalists also make claims. And when I'm saying journalism, I mean, because we are discussing public scholarship, I don't mean editorials, right? I mean actual reportage, right? So journalists also make claims, academics also make claims, but the way they make claims and what they make claims about is different, right? Largely journalistic reportage is about current events. It's about what is in the news cycle. It's about things that have happened today or yesterday, right? Academic claim making has a much larger span in terms of time, but also in terms of geographies, in terms of concepts, and so on and so forth, right? The way in which journalists and academics use evidence is very, very different, right? Our evidence, very rightly pointed out, our evidence comes from previous literature, right? What our field has published, that's one of our major sources of evidence. We can, of course, go out and do field work, look at data, watch films, do whatever our data is. And the way in which we utilize that data is also very different from how journalists do it. And one of the major differences lies in the marrying together of data and concepts that we do in academic writing, right? Journalists are not required to do that. So they may be reporting on an election, for instance. They don't need to really go to the concepts of democracy, right? But we do. When we write academically, we just reporting on election data or just saying, okay, so many people voted, does not cut it in academic writing, right? We need to do something more, and that more comes from concepts, right? And also a long durée, like a long, long history of concepts and events that we trace, right, in academic writing. Now, this is precisely what makes academic writing coded, right? And when I say coded, I mean actual coding, right? And so my favorite example to take is that very often we will say hegemony when we want to say power. Or at least that's the charge that is put on us, that you are unnecessarily complicated, you use big words, you use obscure terms, right? And which is probably the charge as to why academic writing is allegedly not public, right? That, you write in a very boring, jargonisty manner, right? Any other reason why you think academic writing is considered to be not public? Yeah. Go ahead. I'll come to you. Go ahead. That's my question to you. So I take the example of, do we have a mic? Huh. Huh. Say more. What is this community that you're talking about?
Hello.
Yeah.
You said that our arguments in academic writing comes from our discipline and the community maybe which we belong to, but that is not the public, which you're pointing out over here, right?
Yeah.
Do we
No.
mean the popular?
You're absolutely right. In fact, I'm questioning what the public is. So when we say what we need to do public facing scholarship or we need to write for popular platforms, I'm actually asking what really is public and popular. And I agree with you, right? That for the community that we write for and that we write with, we are doing a public enterprise, right? That's the idea that I have decided to stay with after years of writing in academia, that we could define public or popular in many ways, right? And there are entire disciplines which are based on defining the public and the popular: cultural studies, political science, so on and so forth, right? And they also have various imaginations of what the public is. And so you're absolutely right that since we are writing in a very niche coded way, we are writing for a public of our own, right? Now that public may be very tiny and very specialized, but that's okay. That's still public, right? And so sometimes, what a physicist may be writing, I may not be able to understand, and vice versa, right? And so our communities are very tightly defined, but sometimes there is also cross communication possible. So I can read a historian's piece and largely make some sense of it, right? And so we are in the business of addressing a certain kind of public, right? And we are also, when we write, we are also sort of addressing the popular within this public, right? Now, where do you think then this charge comes from? That academic writing is very inward looking. They don't talk to people outside. They don't write too much outside. Nobody understands what they are saying. Where do you think that charge is coming from? There's too much self-referentiality, I agree, and that's a core percept of academic writing, because we do need to cite and refer to others who've written before us, right? So yeah, there's also self-referentiality of language, right? So within all our disciplines, there will be certain concepts and terms and words that only we understand, right? So our scales and our models and our sort of theories and so on and so forth, right? So if I walk into this room and I say contractarian state, it's like we are speaking in a code, right? And a computer engineer sitting in the room might just be like, what the hell you're talking about, right? So there's that charge. Anything else? Yeah. Yeah, that's quite a deterrent, right? Who's there to read 10,000 words, especially now, right? And so the format is deterring, the form is deterring, the language is deterring. Also, our concerns are deterring at times for a larger public, I would say, right? So if I am, looking at one small kingdom in medieval central India, and I'm actually specializing in the tax regime of that medieval kingdom in Central East India, how many people will be interested in it? Right? That's the rhetoric question that is asked of us. I believe actually many people would be interested in it, but that's a separate thing. Yeah. Yeah, so that's what the structure of it, which is a necessity for us. We need that layering to make our arguments, but that precisely makes it a little difficult for let's say, a lay person. And that lay person, like I said, could also be a fellow academic who's not in my discipline, right? So our public is very limited. Now, if you ask me personally, I would say that's okay, right? And I'll tell you why, and I'll give you an example. I would personally think it's okay because it's not necessary that everyone has access to all kinds of writing. And I'm not making an inegalitarian argument here, right? I'm all for a very democratic, egalitarian dispersal of knowledge, right? But the form of that knowledge is what I'm debating. So, for instance, we don't ask computer scientists to decode their code, right? That's never the demand. That coding, actual coding, is very complex, jargony, or difficult. And I will not use the app, but I need to know exactly what the code says. We never say that. We are happy using the app. We are happy with that interface, which is simplified for our experience, right? And I tend to think of academic work, not writing only, but academic work a little like that. That the demand to simplify that coding may not always be justified, right? Because we are dealing with complex problems, we are raising complex questions, and the answer to that will be complex. It can't be simple, right? But yes, what we can do is put out a public facing form of that complex answer. And that is what I think is public scholarship, or public facing scholarship, or writing for popular media, right? Where you're retaining the complexity, but your UX UI is different. Your app interface is different, literally, right? Now, let's actually look at an instance of academic writing, right? And this is one of my favorite examples to take. So between 1995 and 1998, this journal called Philosophy and Literature ran a bad writing contest. Has anybody heard of this contest? Yeah? Okay. So they ran a bad writing contest. It was quite hilarious, and they had very strict rules saying, we're not looking at meme was not a word then, but we're not looking at sort of artificially produced writing for the purpose of this context. So you can't joke around with it. This has to be academically peer-reviewed, published journal or book articles, book chapters, books, which are actually written. It's not a joke, right? Now in 1998, Judith Butler won this prize, right? Most of us know Butler. Butler is a post-colonial theorist, feminist theorist, and she's known for writing in a very difficult way. And she has her reasons, right? And we'll get into those reasons. Now, this was the paragraph from Butler which won the prize. So they were very specific. They just didn't say Butler writes bad. They actually give you it's like the film fair, right? So which song are you winning it for? They tell you. So Butler won it for this paragraph, right? Now, let's read through the paragraph, and then I'll ask you whether it's bad or good or what is it. Can I have a volunteer to read through this paragraph? Anyone? Eventually, a lot of you will read, because there's a lot of reading coming up. So, yes, please go ahead. Take a mic, yeah.
The move from a structuralist account in which capital is understood to structure social relations in relatively homologous ways to a view of hegemony in which power relations are subject to repetition, convergence, and rearticulation brought the question of temporality into the thinking of structure and marked a shift from a form of Althusian theory that takes structural totalities as theoretical objects to one in which the insights into the contingent possibility of structure inaugurate a renewed conception of hegemony as bound up with the contingent sites and strategies of the rearticulation of power.
Okay. So this is from her piece in the journal Diacritics, right? What do you notice about this paragraph? It's one sentence, yeah. And Butler is capable of writing much longer sentences, right? So I think they chose, a relatively okay paragraph to give the award to. But, so it's one paragraph. What else do we notice? No, not the content, but like Althusian theory, right? With no reference of what, yeah. Absolutely, yeah. What else? repeated uses of the word structure, which is also, and this is where the code kicks in, right? So if you know your political theory, post-colonial theory, then you know that structure is a core component of that theory. It's a core concept. And, so she's using it as a conceptual term, right? But we'll come to that. What else do we notice? This side of the room. Yeah. Theoretical frameworks? Where is the theory? Sorry, pass the mic. Yeah. Where is the theory?
No, he mentions the form of Althusian theory.
Althusserian theory, okay, and then moves to the argument.
First, he claims the move from a structuralist account.
Huh.
That is his argument, and followingly, he's connecting it with a theoretical framework.
Correct. So there is a very distinct sense of Butler's argument there. We know what she is or what they are actually referring to, right? And we can distinguish their argument from the theoretical bit that they are using, right? Now, this is also training, right? If somebody outside this room were to read this paragraph, they would not make these distinctions. It's our training of reading texts like these, of distinguishing argument from theory from empirical evidence, that we can make this distinction, right? Now, do you think this is bad writing? No. Yes? Why? Yeah. True. Absolutely. I completely agree. But does anybody... sorry. Yeah, I would also say bad is not... I get what the journal is doing. The journal was doing something very political and hilarious and exactly what Gayatri is saying, right? It was pointing out to a larger trend in the way in which academic writing was being done. And I'll come back to what Gayatri said. Yeah. Yes, diacritics. Yeah. 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 People also voted. Yeah, it was a bit like a modern day reality show. Who decides any award? There's a jury, it was not a public voting in that. So this is academics deciding on what is bad academic writing. That's a good question actually. So absolutely lay public is not saying this is bad public. They're academics only. So this is a journal which is running this. So one can assume the editors and the editorial board team and whatever, right? So yeah, going back to what Gayatri said, does anybody know why this kind of writing became popular or even acceptable in some circles? And why did academic writing take this form? Does anybody know that story? Can anybody guess it? I mean, why would many academics choose to write exactly like this? But remember, and I often like to remind ourselves this, remember who's reading diacritics? It's just people like us, no. It's like even from within us, it will be 1 or 2% who will read diacritics. It's a very niche philosophy kind of theory kind of journal, right? So actually, Butler or anybody else wouldn't think that they are throwing these words at them. Because whoever has picked up a diacritic to read, issue to read, actually understands all that is being written there. Not really. Not really, right? Because, and this is what we keep forgetting, that academic writing is meant for a very niche audience, is meant for a very narrow audience, right? It may take other forms. You can tweet about your argument, but the actual academic writing form is only meant for about 10-15 people who will read your article. In social sciences. In sciences, maybe 200-300 people who will read your article, right? So think about it from that perspective, and which is why the next thing I was asking is it bad academic writing? Where Kaushalya's question becomes very important, right? It could be bad writing if a layperson is reading it, right? But if a community of peers is reading this, it can still be bad writing. It can still be what Gayatri is saying, unnecessarily dense and jargony and so on and so forth, right? But coming back to why would a lot of us choose to write like this? If not exactly like this, in this format. Any guesses? Yes, partly yes. And we must remember that Western academia derives itself from classical Greek writing and Latin writing. So yes, it does follow. Yeah. 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 Yeah, and you just did the same. So you said solipsistically writing, right? So there is a way in which we are trained to talk like this, and there's a reason for that training. For Butler and many others, like Homi Bhabha, for instance, right? They are responding to a certain post-colonial condition, right? Where they are actually saying that we will write in dense ways. One, because what I said earlier, the reality that we are addressing is dense. It's not a simple question or answer that we are getting. So actually, and you can go back and read this. So after Butler won this award, Martha Nussbaum wrote a public piece, not an academic piece, a public piece critiquing Butler's writing, right? And kind of supporting, I mean, she doesn't really say that she should have got the bad writing award, but I mean, Nussbaum puts forward her argument about why Butler's writing is dense and is difficult and it's inegalitarian because it stops people who don't have access to English or may not have very elite education. It stops them from accessing this argument, and Nussbaum is absolutely fair and right in saying that, right? Interestingly, Butler responds to Nussbaum. And this whole debate is available. If you just Google Nussbaum-Butler debate on writing, you will get, so they write back and forth about 2-3 times each, 2 times each for sure, right? And that whole debate is there and you can read it, it's fascinating, right? And so the argument that Butler makes in response to Nussbaum, right, is that the reality is so complex and the questions are so complex that a simplified language, which is devoid of concepts and what is called jargon and so on and so forth, will not cut it. So, she's saying we're not trying to be inegalitarian here. We are trying to address a very complex reality. That was Butler. Now, others like Homi Bhabha, for instance, have argued that we will write like this because we are writing back to the colonizer. We are writing in the language of the colonized. Right? And so somebody like Fano said, we won't be able to think and write in English ever or French ever because it's the language of the colonizer. So whatever we think and write will be derived, will be a derivative discourse. There'll be no original thinking. So the Kaviraj has also argued that in the Indian context, right? Now, some post-colonial scholars like Bhabha would say, not necessarily. We can master the master's language, right? And write better than them, write more complex than them. Of course, Butler is not saying that. Butler is of a different lineage. But that's also the argument that some of the post-colonial scholars would make, right? That asking simplicity from us is like colonizing us all over again, right? We were colonized we were colonized because we were thought of as simple, as barbaric, as naive, and so on and so forth. So if we are writing in the language of the colonizer, it will not be simple. Right? So there are many reasons why somebody would write like this, right? Now, it is for us to decide whether we think that this is bad academic writing or is it actually conceptual, political in its own way, has a particular reason to it, right? And of course, if you read Butler enough, you know that they don't always write like this. Right? So there are many, many, many passages of Butler which are immensely readable and understandable, right? But there are some moments in their writing which is like this. So what I also want to say is that it's also a spectrum is also possible. There will be moments in our work where we have to write in complicated ways, but there will also be moments when simplicity works. And of course, there is personal voice and tone and style and all of that, right? Okay, let's look at some of these examples actually of how academic writing for an academic audience looks and what are the various forms that it can take. Jyot? Yes. I wouldn't say fear. Fear is too strong a word. But yeah, there's a certain gatekeeping. And academic gatekeeping, though, is notoriously famous, right? So there's a certain gatekeeping for sure, right? But, and this is not to justify gatekeeping, but linguistic gatekeeping is done by a lot of other professions. Lawyers, for instance. And recently there was a move in the Indian judiciary to say, let's not write judgments like this, right? In that staid, very colonial language, let's get away from that and let's write judgments in a more sort of conversational language. And there was opposition to that because lawyers and judges and all said, not possible, right? Because there is a certain meaning that Latin phrase carries, which is not translatable, which is not replaceable. Doctors is another example, right? So there are many kinds of coding that many professions use, and this is one example of that, right? Okay, let's look at what are some other ways in which academic writing for academics appears. It doesn't always appear like Butler, right? And my favorite example is Partha Chatterjee because he's one of the most sort of readable academic writers that I have read. And he says the most complex things, but in very, very simple ways. And it's almost like reading a novel when you're reading Chatterjee, most of the times, right? And this is the beginning of the last chapter of his book, Politics of the Governed. Here is Chatterjee being sarcastic, being sort of trying to tell a joke in his own way, right? And he says, Are Indian cities becoming bourgeois at last? Right, that's a title of his chapter. Or if you prefer, we could exclaim, are Indian cities becoming bourgeois alas? Right? And no matter what the underlying sentiment, there are several reasons for asking a question as this, right? So this is the peak of academic writing. I mean, this is a very, very well-known political theorist writing one of his most famous books, right? And this is the opening of a chapter in that book. But he is in two very simple sentences, which are not even quote unquote academic or conceptual or whatever, but is actually based on wordplay, right? Between at last and alas, he's managed to convey his entire argument, right? So if you read the whole chapter and you come back to these opening two lines, this is the argument. He is lamenting that in the chapter, through academic argumentation and evidence and everything, he is lamenting that Indian cities have become bourgeois, and that's not a good thing. Right? So his argument is there in anyone would get it, right? If they know English, all of those writers there. But if you can access English, you understand a very complex argument that he is making. And you also get the sort of the tension between, have Indian cities become bourgeois at last, right? Have they finally become bourgeois and we are very happy about it? And the fact that, have Indian cities become bourgeois alas, right? You get the tension in the argument, even if you're not a political science person, even if you're not an urban studies scholar, you get it, right? So there is, and this is considered to be a very good academic, one of the top academics, right? Academic writing can also look like this. So academic writing could also look like this. This is a journal, peer-reviewed journal article, one of Emily Martin's piece, which changed the discourse when it came out in 1991. It fundamentally changed the way in which we look at science, the way in which social scientists look at scientific practice and scientific method. Martin's piece was a path breaker in that. And this is the crux of her argument. Can somebody read out this small para for us? Yeah. Yeah, so I've not given you any context for the piece, and if you haven't read the piece, then this is the only thing that you are reading of it, right? But do you get the argument? Do you get what she's trying to say? Yes, no? Yes? It's fairly clear, right? She is talking about how science has talked about the sperm and the egg, and how the sperms got disproportionate attention from science, but not scientifically, actually, right? But linguistically. How the sperm is written about is almost as if a majestic male figure is being written about when it's actually a cell, right? Now, here is a sociologist, anthropologist writing a peer-reviewed journal article, right? Without any jargon. There are citations, right? So there is that academic practice of citing people, going back to previous literature and so on and so forth, but there's hardly any jargon. There's irony, there's sarcasm there, but there's no jargon, there are no big concepts, right? It's immensely accessible, even if you don't know sociology, you get what she's trying to say, right? And so this is a good example of what academic writing can also look like, right? And again, remember, she is also writing for a community of peers. She's not writing for a broader audience, right? But her argument remains as complex as Butler's argument, right? Okay, last example. This. Right? Now, what would we think of this? Is this complex, jargony, or is it simple, understandable? Sorry? It's fully opaque. Others? Not really understandable. Is it? Right? But if there were economists in the room, they would say it's absolutely understandable what is happening. Right? They will also tell you that there's regression analysis happening here, this is how the formula is made, and so on and so forth. Right? Actually, if you read the larger piece, I'm sorry, I forgot to write where this is from. This is from a very interesting article by Michael Olkin. We've discussed this before. This is a very interesting piece by Michael Olkin and others on caste and rural electrification in UP. And they're looking at census data to talk about which villages have got electricity, which haven't, right? And if you read the piece, then actually, I'm not trained to do statistics at all. But if you read the piece, by the time you come to this formula, you actually understand it, right? Because they've clearly, step by step, explained what each of those values mean. And it is as simple as SC actually means scheduled caste. BSP actually means the party BSP, right? So they have coded the formula with terms that we know, and then they have, of course, made it into a formula, right? And so this is also academic writing, right? And for those of us who understands econometrics or statistics or quantitative method, this is as clear as Martin's or Chatterjee's line, right? Now, I'd like for us to think a moment on what would happen when any of this or Butler is made public. When you take this writing and you try and write, either you take this for a larger audience outside your community, or you try and write this public for a larger public, what are the forms that it will take? Now, some of this may carry as such. Right, so Chatterjee and Martin might just carry as such. You can just go and publish it on a forum or a newspaper and it will still carry the point. But Olkin and Butler might need some translation. Right, and so it really sort of depends on discipline, style of writing, method. Right, so if I had actually picked up a part of Olkin's article where he is describing what BSP has done for village politics, then it would actually read very simply like Chatterjee or Martin. We could easily take it to a newspaper and it would make equal amount of sense, right? But this part of Olkin's writing, and I mean, you cannot really convince an economics person to simplify this, right? This is as simple, and I've run it by economists, and this is as simple as it gets. We really can't do anything about it. What we can do, and this is the crux of what we are discussing, so what we can do is that we are writing for a broader audience. Instead of giving the formula, we give you the final result. We give you what the formula told us, right? And so their result would be that in villages with less political mobilization, electrification is also less. So that sentence actually is for a wider audience. It makes sense. But it is backed by this formula, right? So if we are able to keep that conversation going, right, that writing for a larger audience, more publicly, more popular platforms, doesn't mean we miss out on the formula, right? Doesn't mean that we sort of simplify what we are saying. Doesn't mean we give up on our sources, right? But we make it more conversational, we make it more accessible. That's what we have to do, right? And that is why we are saying you have to retain your academic argument, and we'll see how. I'll just give you an example. So very quickly, just to sum up some things that we've been discussing. So what makes scholarship public, right? And here public could mean this room also, because God knows we need clarity within this room also, right? In the ways in which we are writing. So whatever you think of public, What makes academic arguments, why take it public? That's very simple. We take it public to get away with gatekeeping. We just discussed gatekeeping, right? So why is it that only 10 people will know about caste and rural electrification? It deserves a broader canvas. It deserves a broader conversation, right? Also, intervention in public debates, and academics are very well poised to intervene in public debates, in public policy debates, because they come from deep research and very long histories of research, right? And so they do have a much deeper and broader sense of the problem than, say, a bureaucrat would have, or a think tank person would have, because just the amount of study is not comparable. There's also the politics and ethics of knowledge circulation. So are we going to then keep whatever my research is, are we going to keep it bound? And this argument becomes, this aspect becomes even more urgent when we're talking about science, pure natural science, right? So we know what gatekeeping and keeping knowledge private in science means. We saw what happened in COVID, for instance, right? So if you don't make knowledge public, especially scientific knowledge, it has serious consequences. Similarly, for social science and humanities, there are a lot of research that we have done and a lot of arguments that we have made which could actually make changes on ground. And that deserves it not just deserves to be circulated publicly, but it also needs to be critiqued publicly. That is also important, right? It needs to, and this is especially true for social sciences, this knowledge that we are producing needs to go back to the people who've helped us produce it. So our field, for instance, very few of us take our work back to the field, back to our respondents, right? But we need to. They need to know what is being written about them, but they also need to be stakeholders in the knowledge you're producing, right? And some academics are actually doing that in very, very, very different ways, translating their work, for instance. That's the biggest thing, right? Translating your work in the language in which you did your field work, right? That could be one very basic way to go public. So by public, we don't just mean writing in wire and scroll. Going public could also mean this, or translating your research into art, exhibition, performance forms, and which doesn't mean you have to be a researcher and an artist both, right? Which also means you collaborate, right? So you collaborate with people who can translate your research into a larger thing. A very simple example, but a fun example of this is, again, there's this YouTube, actually no, there is this, there's this collective which also has a YouTube channel which is called Dance Your PhD. It's very fun. You must look at it. So every year they invite entries from PhD scholars or groups of PhD scholars who will dance their PhD, right? And they are free to imagine it in any form possible. But it's a great way. And I've gone through many of those videos and I actually understand molecular biology PhDs because they're dancing it out and they are making it or forensic science PhDs who are enacting a whole crime scene through dance and stuff like that, right? So that's a easy example, but it's an effective example to show how, research can go public in many, many different ways, right? Twitter threads, a lot of academics do Twitter threads these days. Again, a very effective way to reach out. But we need to keep in mind that popular doesn't mean simplified. Because we don't need to dumb down, because the popular or the public is not less intelligent than us in this room. We need to really be careful, really seriously be careful of that, right? So we don't need to simplify what we are saying. We can explain what we are saying, and I'll show you an example of that, right? How explanation doesn't mean simplification, right? So let's put our argument out there in its entire complexity, right? And also accessible doesn't mean non-conceptual. So there's a way in which you can avoid the Althuserian and the structural, but still say things that Althusser said, right? And be sure that somebody reading that will find out who Althusser is, what they said, right? So we also don't need to be patronizing in the sense that only we know who Althusser is. Somebody who doesn't know will Google it. Today we are also living in a different age of knowledge dissemination, right? Somebody who doesn't know will Google it, will figure it out. There are many easy explanations available, right? What is important for us to remember is this shift in audience, which is we are not writing for people who speak the same language. Right? So Althusserian will not cut it because, okay, 5 of us may understand what Althusserian is, but if we just say that, you know, this, by doing this, I'm talking more about process than structure. I am talking about more about agency than the structure of things. That's Althusserian without saying Althusserian. Right? Actually, that's Gramsci. I messed up there, but you get the point, right? Okay, so you're writing for a broader public. Okay, very important, and I've said this before, we are not, when we're writing as academics, we're not writing our opinion, either in the academic form or in the larger public form. We're also not doing reportage. You may want to do that, but that's a separate enterprise. That's not your academic argument, right? So your argument stays, and all that scientific method and rigor of argument stays. You still need to do claim evidence. You still need to give your references, right? The form might change. You may not give a footnote on wire, but you may actually then want to say, according to sociologist so-and-so, and explain what they are saying, right? And most importantly, you may not want to, when you're writing for a public, you not want to go into too much theory, which we do when we write academically. We go into literature reviews, we say what was said earlier, we explain our theoretical premise, may not be needed for a larger audience, but the crux of the theory can come in through examples. And again, I'll show you how this is done, right? And so examples, real world events, topical things happening are your friend when you're writing for the public, right? And most of our articles, when we send it out to public fora, get rejected because they're not topical, right? Because again, if either you are researching on such a niche, like a medieval kingdom finance structure, there'll never be a time that will be in news. But if you can link it to a concern, that is the best. But if you are doing more contemporary work, which has policy relevance, which has news, then it's easier. Because you then look at what is the discourse, what is the debate, right? And you have to write quickly, but you plug in your research there and say, okay, this larger thing is being discussed, and my little corner of research tells us this about the larger question, about the question being discussed, right? So that's the mode really. So when we write for the public, larger public, we write with a very sharp claim. So claim stays. It's a very academic claim. But we don't go into too much of a literature review or who said what and so on and so forth. We stay with a narrow, sharp, 1-2 kind of claims, right? Which is immediately will make a connect with someone who is not going to read your Plato and Aristotle and so on and so forth, but have the same concerns of what is happening to democracy or what is happening to the society, right? So you need a narrative or you need a problem that you are addressing, right? Of course, there are also in the public, also public fora, there are also niche public fora, which will publish your niche research also. So that's the fun of writing today, that there are many, many kinds of platforms that we can write on. So a Medium or an Aeon or one of these specialized publications will also publish very niche, obscure research. And you don't really need to link it to topical issues. But even then, you can't follow the journal article structure. You don't have 10,000 words to begin with. You have 1,000 words. So you have to say your thing in 1,000 words, newspapers even smaller, 700-800 words, right? And you have to give evidence. So let's not think that if you're writing for the public, you're not writing for pure academics, then you don't have to give evidence. You have to still give evidence. And you trust the intelligence of your audience that they are not sitting there to discuss what you believe, right? So you give evidence. And again, I'll show you how evidence is given. But before I take you to that example where I'll show you all of this, I want you to write. What I want you to do is take Butler's sentence / paragraph and decode it, right? And we've discussed coding, decoding. So decode it and rewrite it for a popular platform. While keeping all of this in mind, that it need not be dumbed down, it need not be simplified, it needs to have its argument and its theory, right? But in a way in which somebody who's not been to a BA in history or English or whatever understands it, right? So that's your job. It's just one sentence, right? So you have to write 100 words at the most, because this is about 82 words. So I'm giving you a little more. 100 words, right? Preferably 1-2 sentences. Retain the crux of what Butler is saying. Now remember, let me make it easier. You don't need to really summarize what Butler is saying. So you don't need to capture everything that they are saying from A to Z. You can also write about 1 or 2 aspects of what they are saying, right? But do this and you can scan that QR code and submit your response there. So you can type your response directly. I'll tell you where this goes. This is completely anonymized. It goes to this website called Padlet. You don't need to sign in. You don't need to give your names or anything. It'll prompt you to submit under a pseudonym. You can choose that if you want. And responses are not recorded, right? So nobody will have access to this, completely private, right? So I think it should be okay to submit here. And as you're submitting your responses will show up here, again, completely anonymized. Okay. So you can scan the code and just type your response in what pops up, and it'll show up on our screen. Let's give it 5-7 minutes, 10 minutes. Okay. Let's try. Yeah.
We can Google.
Of course, it's not a test. So you can Google what you don't understand. You may use ChatGPT to simplify it, right? But my only suggestion would be to work on the draft that GPT gives you, right? Because GPT may fundamentally misunderstand what Butler is saying. So see what it gives you and rework it, right? Vet it and rewrite it, right? But let's try and see if it is as easy to write simply, to write for a broader, because writing like this is difficult, but is the opposite easy or not, right? And you can discuss amongst yourselves, ask what each of these terms means, do whatever. I mean, it's not a test. Anything, because you're writing for a popular platform. Yeah. If you're writing for academia, once you are Partha Chatterjee, then you can write like that, right? Not otherwise. Don't risk your careers writing like that otherwise. He's writing that at the peak of his career. He's already a very well-known academic. Yes, of course. Of course you can write like that, yeah. If you only write like that, that's a problem, right? If the whole thing reads like the conversation, even Chatterjee doesn't do that. That's just the opening. Yeah, after that opening, he goes core academic. And once he got? No, not really. His status comes from writing academically and engaging with academics. But I would say even early Partha Chatterjee, like some of his earliest works when he was not very well known, they also read they have a similar tone, which is a very accessible tone. So he's always written like that. Like he's never written like a Kaviraj, for instance. Kaviraj is dense. You need to know 3 other things to read Kaviraj. But Chatterjee has never written like that. So he's always written in a very accessible, yet making very landmark arguments. So what at this age, it gives him some immunity. So I always say, as you become more and more senior in academics, your footnotes start going down. That is what happens. You don't need to refer as much. People believe what you are saying without 10 citations. But most people do follow the rigorous claim evidence pattern still. Yes, yes, you can also handwrite it and put a picture on Padlet. That's also, as long as we can read your writing. let's take a couple of minutes and finish the sentence we are writing. Finish what we are writing, submit it. We quickly see what responses we've got, and then we move on. Okay, let's start submitting, wrapping this up. Doesn't need to be perfect, like a full blown thesis, it doesn't need to be. Just one sentence. You just scan this, it'll take you to a blank page. You just submit your response, photo or typing there. Yeah, I think picture should work. Okay, let's stop and let's submit. All right, we have one response. Let's see more responses. Okay, let's see more responses. Is it allowing you to add photographs? It should. Is it happening, Joe? Oh. Allowing you to upload photographs? Anyone tried? Oh. There is an option. There is an option, huh? Lovely. So let's start with the shortest. Because wow, some are longer than Butler. Okay. Where did the shortest one go? Yeah. So the society that the society that considers capital to be dictating their social relations will keep repeating the same mistakes until they take agency over capital to bring changes. Right? I mean, we can think about whether they've captured the meaning fully or not, but here we are thinking more about whether people who don't know Butler, Althusser, hegemony, etc., get a sense of what is being said, right? So there's this, then there is, I'm reading Brilliant Dory, that one. With a structuralist approach, here you've lost the audience, right? With a, with a structuralist, nobody understands structuralist approach, right? So we needed to, and this is what I mean, we needed to explain structuralist approach, right? Anyways, with a structuralist approach, capital structures the social relations in a series or pattern that can somewhat foreground. This is ChatGPT. This is a ChatGPT summary in all probability, right? So we don't need to, see, we don't need a summary of what Butler is saying. We need to be able to explain what Butler is saying to someone who's never read Butler, right? That's the point. Okay. Anyone who's used an example to explain what Butler is saying? You have in the photograph? Okay. Yes. Okay, can you read it out, please? Yeah. Mike, can we get her the mic? No, we're not doing wrong or right here, because I understand that many of us don't know what Butler.
Yeah.
We're not looking at right and wrong. We're looking at accessibility.
Okay.
Yeah.
Shift from colonial power structure, where capital remains as the fulcrum, to a post-colonial deconstruction of that structure into multiple sites of power with the emergence of neocolonialism.
Right. A little more accessible, although again, neo-colonial depends on where we are writing for. Again, if we are writing for a Wire or a Medium or a Eon or one of these really niche websites, then neo-colonialism makes a lot of sense.
Okay, so I was basically trying to capture the temporality where she says, so maybe a jump from colonial to neo-colonial or post-colonial. So that way I was trying.
That works way better. This jump
Yes.
gives a easier handle to what is happening, right? Okay, let's see another one where I saw example. Xavier, this long one. So earlier, many thinkers believed society worked like a fixed structure. See, this is good, right? So this is structuralism, but said in a way in which people don't stop reading the moment they read structuralism. In that view, capitalism shapes social relations in a stable and predictable way, right? Again, very easy explanation. Everything seems tightly organized and power looks solid and permanent. But Judith Butler argues for a different understanding. She says power is not fixed or unchangeable. Instead, it is constantly being repeated, adjusted, and reshaped through everyday action, language, and social practices, right? Easier to follow, right? But doesn't quite mess with the essence of what Butler is saying or the complexity of what they are saying, right? For example, gender roles seem natural, but they continue only because society keeps repeating certain behaviors and expectations. If people act differently, those norms can shift, right? So this is what I meant by an example. It immediately helps the person reading it understand what this big deal about structure and power shift and so on and so forth was, right? Okay, let's read one more. I hope this opens. No. Okay. Let's read this one. No, this one we have read. Okay. Initial theorists, I'm reading the oh, very nice. We have a Picasso-like art, but we need more. We need someone to explain. It's a great way to actually take that big chunk of theory, but a title or a caption or something, or 1-2 lines with it would have helped more. Because again, remember, this can be as obscure for a reader than as Butler is, right? So even when we are thinking of non-textual forms, let's not assume that all non-textual forms are equally accessible, right? So we might need a little more to go with it, but I kind of understand where this is going. Whoever has done this, thank you. This is very, very nice. Okay. All right. Anyone else wants to? Let me try and refresh this. But I think we are getting a sense of how difficult it is to write simply and write for a broader audience, right? Because we are used to the code of our disciplines. So, and this is what I meant to say, that saying structuralism or saying medieval is a shorthand. And it often saves us the trouble of really explaining what hegemony is or what structuralism is. And we get away with it because our audience in the closed space understands that, and there's no need to explain. It's when we have to do this, that we have to decode exactly what structuralism is, exactly what Althusser said, what is capital, that it becomes difficult. And that is where actually our argument is tested. That we made this big argument, but can we actually break it down and explain its components to someone, right? And so many a times writing like Butler is easier because it's a mutually understood code. But this is way more difficult, right? Let's look at, and if you want, I can make a PDF out of these and circulate it with the organizers so that you have it. You have these responses. If you want, you can keep submitting here. But let's look at one example of a career academic who's done very well with public scholarship, right? And that is Satish Deshpande. A lot of us know him, maybe personally also. He's taught a lot of people in this room. So Satish Deshpande is a sociologist who's retired from the University of Delhi, Department of Sociology, and he's very, very, very well known for his work on caste, education, affirmative action, and so on and so forth. And he is a splendid writer. Even his academic pieces are beautifully written, very, very well argued, very accessible. But, and especially after retirement, he's really taken to writing for the public at large. And he has produced some iconic pieces, right? One of them is this, The Story of My English. And I often use it as an academic piece because I think he's almost writing it like a journal article. But he's written it for India Forum, which is, again, it's a widely read website. It may have a slightly niche audience. I mean, a certain kind of wider audience reads India Forum. And so a lot of what Deshpande is saying here is immediately sort of resonating with that audience. But which is what I meant when I said we need to think about where we are writing for, right? And who's their audience and what is the kind of timeline and et cetera, et cetera. So let's look at just some paras from Deshpande's piece. Have you read The Story of My English? No. Oh, you must read it. You must absolutely read the full piece. It is just beautiful. Okay. So what I've done is I have, the full piece would be difficult to fully discuss here. So I have taken a small part of it, right? You know the background. He's a sociologist who works on social inequality, questions of access, privilege, and so on and so forth. So here is a career academic who is very well versed in sociological debates and that language and so on and so forth, writing this piece. And let's read through it. And now that you've done this exercise yourself of trying to decode, let's do the opposite now. So let's see what Deshpande is writing as a decoded language and what is the concept behind it or theory behind what he's saying, which he's not writing in that complex form, right? But he's meaning it. So we'll recode Deshpande here, right? But also pay attention to how he gets his point across very, very effectively, right? Okay, can I have a volunteer to read for us, please? Yeah, Jyot. Yes. That is the so-called abstract that came with the piece. Yeah. Okay, sorry, I started from the middle, so let me just give you this background. He starts the piece by describing his childhood. This childhood home that he grew up in, which was in a small industrial town in India. He doesn't name the town, but we could imagine it's a setting like Bokaro or Jamshedpur, which is entirely an industrial town. And he's saying that they had these neighbors, Siddiquis, and as children, they would often go and play at the Siddiquis' house. And so this is a description of the Siddiqui house, what they would do there as children, and so on and so forth. So that's the thing, yeah. That comes. Don't reveal. Comes, yeah.
What?
Nothing, you will read it. Okay. Yeah.
Anyway, one evening when the Siddiquis had visitors for tea and the table had somehow become the topic of conversation, I announced to the adults that it was similar to the one that we had. The conversation would have been in the usual Hindi with frequent English words, and I don't remember exactly what I said, but I did use the word similar in an entirely English sentence. The always indulgent Mr. Siddiqui went into raptures, urging his somewhat bemused visitors to join in praising me. I remember being both elated and embarrassed in a rather nice way. So much so, in fact, that I ran home at once to tell my mother. I was speaking excitedly in the dialect of Kannada, that was our only home language, and at first she did not understand what exactly had happened. Her immediate parental reflex was that she needed to apologize to the Siddiquis for something I had done, but she eventually understood that I had somehow been a credit to her because I knew a certain English word.
And remember, this is Deshpande's childhood, so it's probably early 50s in India. So we're looking at a very different linguistic economy, a very different public education system, very different access to not a globalized, liberalized India, right? So read it in that context, yeah.
Philosophers tell us that language is our earliest and most fundamental worldly possession. Indeed, language not only gives us our world, in a certain sense, it is the world. But English in independent India is not only or simply a language, it is so much more. It can convey the ease of entitlement or the anxiety of aspiration. It can accurately render the subtle shades of our infinitesimal status hierarchies. English, quote unquote, is our most marketed commodity. It is sold to everyone everywhere on the internet, on highway hoardings, along with vocational diplomas and gold jewelry, and on humble wall advertisements, along with sex clinics and marriage brokers. At once foreign and familiar, oppressive and emancipatory, instrumental and symbolic, English in contemporary India is a complex and contradictory phenomena. Its layered and richly textured stories cannot be confined within a single discipline or genre.
Okay, let's pause here for a minute. What did Deshpande do in these two paragraphs? In the first yeah, he starts with a personal experience. It could be a non-personal experience also, something that's happened, an event, an incident, whatever. But what did that do?
Try to infuse like an English word so that he goes to the concept of
Yeah, so that anecdote tells us that a child in the 50s being able to speak a fully English sentence in a tier 2 town in India was an event, right? It will be praised, it will be reported, and that takes us immediately to what he's saying a little later about English being foreign and familiar, oppressive and emancipatory, so on and so forth, right? Now, if he had started actually with this para, philosophers tell us that language is so and so, it would be a very different opening to that, right? And most readers would stop there, right? Remember, we're living in a society where Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone had to be translated into. In UK, it was Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. In the US, it became. In India, it became Sorcerer's Stone, right? In UK, it was Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, right? And the publishers had a meeting with J.K. Rowling and said, you know, outside the UK, if a book title says Philosopher's Stone, it will not sell. People are put off by the word philosophy and philosopher. So can we say something else? And then they decided to, for the rest of the world, make it Sorcerer's Stone, right? And so, you know, I mean, that tells us something about how people access knowledge. Even native English speakers, how do they access knowledge? What is there? How do they access the world? Right? And so, Deshpande starting with this paragraph would have been a very different kind of an audience that he's writing for, right? Also, see how he's not saying philosophers like Saussure tell us or whatever, X, Y, Z, right? He's not name dropping. But he's also not taking away from the complexity of what the philosophers say, right? And India Forum is one popular platform where footnotes are allowed. So there are a few footnotes in this piece, but they are mostly explanatory footnotes, right? But he's not giving us too much of A philosopher says this, B philosopher says this, but he gets the point across, right? And there is that interesting, in a certain sense, it is the world. There is an italicization of is that he is doing, right? And so a astute reader will pick up on that and get the impact of it, right? That language is the world. Language is not in the world, it is the world, right? So he's doing all of that. His editors are doing all of that. They are not missing out on nuance or complexity, right? Okay, so we know from his life what is the meaning that English carries, right? Especially outside of metropolitan cities. We know what philosophers say about language. Let's read ahead and see what happens. Somebody else read. You've read before. Somebody else. You want to read? Okay. The thought.
The thought that one of these stories could be mine did not occur to me until much later. When I was living abroad in an English-speaking country, in my first year as a doctoral student and teaching assistant at a university in California, I was struck and irritated by the frequent compliments I receive on my English. My teachers, fellow graduate students, and the undergraduates whom we taught felt obliged to say that my English was impressive, killer, real neat, and so on. I did not understand why this praise had the odd effect of annoying me until eventually it started to make me angry. Why had I overreacted to what was in the mid 1980s a fairly reasonable question from someone unfamiliar with India? Surely a brown-skinned person speaking in a strangely fluent yet oddly accented English, sounding unlike other brown, black, East Asian or white people, required some explanation. My innocent interlocutor was simply asking for the story of my English because from his American viewpoint there was a story there. But that made my anger even more puzzling. Further dazzling, already difficult and uncomfortable, brought me to an even more embarrassing discovery about myself. Praise for my English offended me because it seemed to signal surprise at being unexpectedly good. Bluntly put, I was affronted because people had not recognized my proper social status and seemed to place me lower than they should have. This was petty because it involved the unreasonable expectation that foreigners identify the status markers that Indians recognize effortlessly, even unconsciously. Mystery solved. I trained myself to respond conventionally to compliments and queries, and that seemed to end the story. Almost a decade later, back in India, I read another story that reopened mine all over again.
Okay, we'll pause here again. Different question to think about this time. What are some of the conceptual categories that Deshpande is writing about here without naming them? Huh? Racism, caste, right? These markers that people are expected to read of us in India, which is basically caste, religion, class. He's right. I mean, Americans had no vocabulary or markers to read them. So they were expecting that, they would not know who a Deshpande is, right? And that in India, somebody with that surname who's able to go to the US in the 80s is definitely coming from a certain caste class background is something that Americans would not read, right? Now, look at how Deshpande is soft launching all of this, right? He's not plunging straight into racism, caste, this, that. He'll come to it. It's not like he's avoiding saying all of it. He'll come to it, but he's letting you take a different route towards that, right? Because of a different audience. Because in academic shorthand, we could very quickly say that, Americans were not reading caste markers of my body, right? And that's the easiest way to say it. But he's taking a more difficult route, right? In trying to really let us arrive at what. He's not mentioned caste and class and race up till now, but we know it. He's made us think about it, right? Okay, pass the mic, someone else. Let's read the last bit from Deshpande. Yeah. So social status is more common a word. Status to everybody uses, hai na? So obviously, again, we're not saying you will strip your language entirely of your disciplinary training. That's not the point. You are writing, remember, you are writing in the public as an academic. You're not expected to write as a lay person, right? Okay, pass the mic, someone else volunteer to read. Yeah.
The Story of My Sanskrit is the title of a famous essay by Kumud Pavade, professor of Sanskrit, well-known Marathi writer and Dalit feminist scholar activist. It was originally the third chapter of Antasphot. I don't know if it's the right pronunciation in Marathi, ma'am. Literally Implosion, a collection of Professor Pavade's autobiographical essays known as a milestone in Dalit feminist writing. As the author acknowledges, it was the English translation of this particular essay that brought her a worldwide readership and stoked interest in Antospot. In it, Kumar Pavade, Ni Somkuar, describes her struggle to overcome casteist opposition on the way to fulfilling her lifelong ambition to become a Sanskrit scholar. For a young Mahar woman in the Nagpur of the 1950s, Sanskrit had to be set apart by quotation marks. It was not allowed to be just a language, academic discipline, or personal ambition. Clearly, the story of My Sanskrit is about caste and not about Sanskrit. In fact, as a claimant to the genre of the testimonio Antospot, is not even or only the autobiography of Kumud Pavade. It is a first-person account or testimonial of the life experiences of a community. The hallmark of the testimonio is that it is a sort of resistance literature that seeks to voice the experiences of a hitherto silenced and oppressed community. It challenges dominant literary conventions by asserting its representative function, which in turn is justified by the compelling moral claims of the community being represented.
Okay, I'll just ask you to pause for a minute here, right? Because I just want to point out this is what I mean by explanation. So, testimonio is something that lay audiences don't come across very regularly. But for those of us who study autobiographies and who study literature, testimonio is not just a genre, it's now become a concept, right? And in this paragraph, right, where he first says that Pavade's autobiography is a testimonio, to this explanation of testimonio as resistance literature, as a story of a community, as someone who knows this literature, I can safely say he has summarized at least 5 academic pieces, right, to tell us what exactly testimonio is, what is its place in Dalit literature, and so on and so forth, right? But he does it in literally that 1, 2, 3, 4 step manner, right? Where if you don't know testimonio, you get a primer. But he has not sacrificed the complexity of it, that it is resistance literature, that it is a story of a community rather than an individual, right? And he has also done that little bit of translation for us, saying the story of My Sanskrit is not about Sanskrit. It's about caste, right? So he is explaining what would be unfamiliar for his audience here. But if he had written a journal article, testimonial would deserve a footnote. You would just say that, Pradeep Nair and Sharmila Rege have talked about testimonial in so and so. That's it. You will just reference it. You will not really explain it. Right? But here he does. So this is what I meant. So structuralists needed to be broken down like this. Althusserian needs to be broken down like this. Right? Okay. Continue, please. And we'll sort of end with this, yeah.
It was only gradually that the possibility of a connection between the very different stories of her Sanskrit and my English dawned on me. The link was the perverse reaction to praise that we seem to share. Kumud Pavade spends the first 2 pages, or almost a quarter, of her story explaining how and why praise for her Sanskrit felt like hot spears, like being stung by gadflies or scorched by hot embers. This was because upper caste praise, which often expanded to include her pronunciation, cooking skills, and overall Brahmin-like cultural refinement, Brahmani Susankritpana, was invariably provoked by the dreadful anomaly, Bhayank Vishangati, of her caste identity as a Dalit. Coming from the opposite direction, my annoyance at praise that seemed to underestimate my social status did not, at that time, seem caste-related to me, nor was it viscerally upsetting as it was for Pavade. But even the faint echo of a similarity prompted further questions. If the benefits of privilege and the costs of prejudice are 2 sides of the same coin, can we produce progressive accounts of privilege using roughly the same techniques used to produce redemptive accounts of struggles against prejudice? Can I, as a Brahmin-born man, tell the story of my English in such a way that it uncovers my caste privilege in a manner comparable to that in which Kumud Pavade, as a Dalit-born woman, tells the story of her Sanskrit to expose the caste discrimination that she faced? This is the difficult and risky question that I eventually grasped that I wanted to ask.
Okay, thank you. Again, we'll just in a minute discuss what he is doing here. But as someone who knows this literature, this field, I can safely say that within academic writing, there is rarely any sort of upper caste academic who's made this argument this powerfully. Right? Now, Deshpande also has academic versions of this argument. Right? So, for instance, he has a piece with the biography of the general caste. Right, where he is taking off from here and saying that, this category needs to be deconstructed. Who's general? Who speaks good English? Right? Who appears like a Brahmin, and so on and so forth, right? So there are those versions. But to actually broach this very delicate topic in the public, where it's not guarded, where only 10 similarly minded people are going to read it. So he had to build up to the question that, can I, as a Brahmin man, ask a story of my English? That if he began with that question, right, it would be a very different engagement with the audience. It would be provocative, it would be rhetorical, it would provoke very strong reactions. But he actually builds up to that big conceptual question that, do we always need to interrogate the Dalit, or can we also start then questioning the upper caste, right? And the formation of the upper caste self, right? So it's a deeply, deeply theoretical conceptual point that he's making. But he does it through his own narrative, which also, again, does a soft launch. If he had done it through other literature, through court cases, through atrocities, this, that, and the other, it becomes a a very charged piece. And I think the way, why this piece becomes so effective, and it's now used in classrooms all over, it's talked about, is because he's literally saying, I'm asking question about myself, my life has brought me here, right? So that's a way to take a very complex, theoretical, very difficult question about caste, race, gender, sexuality, whatever it is that you are asking, and give it a form in which it opens up a conversation. And by talking about himself, Deshpande is opening up that conversation also, which is not really needed in an academic journal, because a readership is very different and what the readers are doing with that article is very different. But here, it is literally forcing the reader to think about their own caste locations. Chances are, this is also an upper caste reader who's reading an India Forum piece in English. So Deshpande is also directly addressing that upper caste reader, right? Now, of course, Deshpande can write about the same thing very differently. And we're not going to read through this, but you can browse through this. This is his journal piece. Sorry, this is a book chapter that he has written very recently, 2025, where he is talking again about English and the politics of English, right? And this is just to give you a sense of how the same thing, here he is discussing race and English, there he is discussing caste and English, right? But he can also take this tone and write it in this manner. Yeah.
Yeah, so I have a problem with whatever you said about the earlier piece. So it seems when he talked about his annoyance with the compliments he was getting about his English when he was abroad, so I feel that he deliberately just focused on his own reflection about his caste position instead of going into race there. Like I feel in that instance when he was annoyed, it came more because of the race dynamics within that context. And so when he translates that work to academic writing, he could not really mold the discussion towards caste because it was...
No, this is a different piece. Okay. Here he is not talking about that experience at all. Okay. In fact, here he is talking about scholarship, right? And the piece is about why most academic scholarship is written in English. So it's sorry, just let me finish. All I'm saying is I'm showing you a different texture of his writing, where he's again dealing with the politics of language. This time the register is not caste. This time the register is actually colonialism, right? So so all I'm trying to show is that the same kind of argument can be written in two different languages, right? And you're right. In his encounter in the university abroad, he could have very well chosen race as a register, but that has been done so much. Generations and generations of Indians have gone abroad and said, we face racism, that's very valid, right? That doesn't take away from that charge. Very few have said it's our caste location which also influences our experience abroad, and that's the novelty and the charge of what Deshpande is saying, right? Sorry, okay, one very brief comment. I need to wrap this up.
My problem was not with the substance of his writing, but the style of writing. My point was that it wasn't naturally flowing towards his argument.
Okay.
It was deliberately, it seemed that it was deliberate, that he steered the conversation.
Yeah, most writing is deliberate. So, yeah, I get what you are saying, but most social science writing is deliberate. And it's nuanced and it has a purpose. You're picking up on that. I get it. Okay, let me just finish this conversation here by giving you a homework. We don't need to do this right now, but you can take away this template and when you're thinking of pitching your public scholarship piece, you can use this template. The Padlet is open if you want to do this and send some ideas on Padlet. Again, we're not sharing those, so don't worry, your idea will not be stolen. But a good way to think about what you want to write. So if you feel like you should be writing about your research in the public, today, next week, in the coming year, A good way to think about it would be to identify one data point, one theoretical argument, one incident, one anecdote. And I actually say the same thing about a journal article. The beginning of a journal article is also this. Think about one thing that you want to say, one example that you want to give. If you can link it to an actual public event or a policy question or a concern that is contemporary, that would be even better, because chances of a forum picking it up, a publication picking up that piece would be far easier, right? So for instance, if right now you were to talk about caste discrimination in campuses, everyone will pick it up because the UGC Act is, the rules are being discussed a lot, right? That's just one example. If you were to write a piece about the business of cricket franchising, right now would sell a lot because IPL is on, right? So also time yourself in that way. Match the argument to the platform logic. So the piece that you will write for Scroll will not be the piece that you will write for, say, the New Yorker, sorry. Very different audience, very different logic. If you choose to make your scholarship public through Twitter or through a reel or through an exhibition, public exhibition, think about who your audience is, what is your form, and which part of your larger argument will fit that form. So take that call. Again, it's very similar to how we choose journals and books for our academic publications. Not everything fits every journal, right? So we do a similar thing. And then try and come up with just this, like about 100-word breakdown I've given you. So think about your core claim in one sentence, like Deshpande did that here in about 30 words. That is his core claim. Remember, when you're pitching your piece, people don't have time to read 250-word abstracts in that industry, in the publication, news, media industry. So can you say it in a few sentences? Will they get the crux of what you want to say? Tell us why it matters now. Right? So even if you're writing about ancient history, why should the reader know about ancient history now? Right? What is the point? Who is your audience for this? Right? Because unlike academic journals, the audience for public fora is very wide and diverse. Right, so some, public policy people might read it, academicians might read it, newsmakers might read it, lay audience might. So who's your audience? Who are you addressing? And what is your evidence for saying? So it's not your diary entry. So what is your evidence for saying it, right? That's usually the pitch we make when we send out our piece to a public forum. Right? So if you can come up with those 100 words of a pitch, right? That's a great starting point to think about why you should be writing this piece, where you should be writing it, and so on and so forth, right? Okay, I will end here. You can take a photo of this if you want. Thank you so much. What we did discuss today was a very thin slice of how arguments are taken public. Right? Like I said, there can be many, many forms to it. I was still thinking of the textual form, right? Which is that instead of writing in a journal, you're writing in a different way in another forum. But there could be many, many non-textual ways, many different modes of taking your argument public. So do think about that as well, right? Okay, thank you so much.